Hello, everybody. Happy Saturday. We have just 3 days to go till the election, and we got a really significant poll out of Atlas Intel yesterday. Uh, we don't have a lot of time to waste. I'm just going to get into this again. Election day is coming around so soon, and this poll is just so fascinating to me that we're going to skip the formalities and just talk about Atlas Intel today. So, in case you missed it, yesterday, Atlas Intel dropped their final New Jersey poll of the cycle, and they show a 1 point race, less than that actually, a 0.9% race between Democrat Mikey Sherrill and Republican Jack Ciattarelli for governor of New Jersey. Now, this is huge. Atlas Intel was the most accurate poll of 2024. It got a lot of credit for predicting the Trump win last year. And it's had some other good election cycles too, like 2020, I believe it was also fairly good. So there are a lot of people who really like Atlas Intel, who really, will trust them to a much larger extent than other polls. I'm not one of those people. I generally don't defer to any poll, in terms of shifting. Like, I don't think any one poll could get me to shift my whole outlook on a race unless there's something really significant that happened. Which is why, for example, when Seltzer dropped, even though Seltzer was considered the gold standard of Iowa, I still had Trump winning it by a likely margin last year. And I'm kind of glad I did that, obviously, because Trump won it decisively and Seltzer was, the streak kind of came to an end. But regardless, there are a lot of people who, I think are fairly are changing their expectations about the race in New Jersey because of this poll. And this is, just based on this poll, this would be a pure toss-up race. It's a 1 point lead for the Democrat Mikey Sherrill, well within the margin of error. And what you see is that if you look at the crosstabs, there's a lot of unpopularity of the current administration, right? Phil Murphy, the incumbent Democrat, is not popular. He's down 10% in approval rating on net, which I think might be a little much, although I do buy that he's not super popular right now. I think in general, and I've talked about this a lot in the past few weeks, Democrats have a big problem in New Jersey that they don't really have in Virginia because they're the incumbent, and there's a bit of voter fatigue because Phil Murphy's been the governor for 8 years now. And then on the other hand, when you look at Donald Trump, he's also unpopular, although not as much as Phil Murphy, which is interesting because most surveys in New Jersey show Trump is down, 15 points in terms of net approval in New Jersey. Here he's only down by 5. He's roughly at 47%, which is, 1% more than the vote percentage he got in 2024. So with Donald Trump at -5 in New Jersey, this would be a pretty good electorate for Jack Ciattarelli, right? Most polls show Trump more unpopular, maybe Phil Murphy a bit less unpopular. And so when you get this electorate that's a little more favorable to Trump, what do you get? A really close race between Sherrill and Ciattarelli. And first of all, being down by 1 is really anyone's game, right? But secondly, even if this poll were to be right and Ciattarelli only lost by 1, I think that would be a really good result for Republicans. This is a state that Trump lost by 6, so Ciattarelli will be outrunning Trump by 5, which is quite significant given the fact that Trump is now in office, and generally we know that off-year dynamics favor the party out of power. But secondly, Sherrill, to me, though she has not run a perfect campaign, is not a weak candidate. This is not a case of like Republicans have a really good candidate and Democrats have a really bad candidate. I think that maybe Ciattarelli is a bit stronger on paper than Sherrill just because he's run this race before and because he did pretty well in 2021 against incumbent Phil Murphy. But I would also argue, that Ciattarelli, having been on the ballot before and having lost, is a little bit of kind of, loser stench, which is why often we see candidates that run for a position 2 times in a row will do worse the second time than the first time, right? That's a big part of it. Then the second thing is that, like Mikey Sherrill, like I'm saying, I do not think is a bad candidate. I think she's a fine candidate. I think she's done a lot of things with her campaign that she could have done better, but she is a representative from a competitive part of the state who's won some tough elections before and who doesn't really have any major scandals. So I think that by itself makes her, at the very least, an average candidate who really should be winning this race in a blue state like New Jersey in a year where Donald Trump is president or Democrats are out of power. This is not 2021. This is more comparable. It should be more comparable to 2017, where Democrats won New Jersey by 15 points. They actually flipped it. So what do we think? Well, if we look at the polling as a whole, you can see that Atlas Intel is a bit of an outlier. They show it as a 1 point race, right? This obviously is a A+ rated pollster, so give it some weight. But this is still an outlier. Suffolk had it had a close race, but it was still Sherrill +4. SoCal Strategies, which is interesting. This is a Republican commissioned poll. Had Sherrill +7, and then YouGov had Sherrill up by 10. And this was seen as a really good poll for Sherrill because at this point, I think a 10-point win for her would be pretty impressive, right? or it would be significantly exceeding expectations. In this range, she had a couple of good polls. 10 in YouGov is quite significant for her. That's pretty decisive. Quinnipiac had her up by 8, which is also solid. And then Fox, this was big. Fox initially, if we look at their earlier poll, had her up by 5 in mid-October. Right, they went from her having her up by 8 to having her up by 5, so a 3-point drop, and then they had her gaining, once again to have her up by 7. So that was pretty good for Cheryl. And these polls showed Chitterelli losing a bit of momentum, right? Obviously, Chitterelli had some better polls like Emerson, where he was only down by 2. He also had the coefficient poll where he's only down by 1. This technically, coefficient often does do polls for Republican campaigns. This is actually an independent coefficient poll. There was some confusion about that on my last video. This is fully independent. And then, again, we had some Democratic polls that had it bigger margin. Then we had a Republican poll in mid-October that had it as a 3-point margin. So, no polls have showed a Chitterelli lead outright, but we do know that there have been some close ones. And Atlas Intel being one of the best polls in this, kind of bucket, having it, the closest out of anybody, that's definitely something to consider. And so, how do I think we should interpret this poll? I think so. My opinion is that we shouldn't really change our outlook on the race that much. This is definitely good news for Jack Chitterelli. There's no two ways about it. But I do think that we have to remember polls are often never consistently perfect. And I know a lot of people like to, kind of use them as like a cheat code or like a gold standard because it makes things easier. And, I as someone who, makes YouTube videos that, try to accurately predict elections, I get the appeal of that. But like Selzer in 2024, that streak usually comes to an end. It often comes to an end when a poll doesn't pass the smell test, right? Atlas Intel, a lot of what they're putting out in 2024, yes, it was a bit more favorable to Donald Trump than, say, the conventional wisdom was. But at the same time, it was not, to me, something that I said that would be so out of line. Whereas this result, I think, would be pretty surprising, at least more so than, Trump winning Michigan, where, yes, I consider Trump to be a narrow underdog in Michigan on Election Day, but I didn't think he was going to lose it by like 6, right? Or 5. I thought he was going to lose it by 1 or 2. And obviously, fair to point out, I was wrong about that. Trump won Michigan by 1.5 points. Okay, so that's what I will say. I will make my final prediction on this race probably on Monday morning. I might release it on Tuesday morning. I'm not sure, but it'll probably be on Monday morning, as well as my final prediction for Virginia. I will release one of them Monday morning, one of them on Tuesday morning. I think I'm going to lean towards doing Virginia on Monday and New Jersey on Tuesday, but I reserve the right to change that. It'll just mostly be based on polling data that we are expecting to get. But I do think we've kind of settled into this spot where the race is clearly competitive. Jack Chitterelli clearly has like a puncher's chance. But Mikey Sherrill's the favorite. I don't think there's a good argument to be made that Chitterelli is favored. What I do think is worth saying is that, again, and I sound like a broken record because I keep saying this in all my videos about this race, but like Democrats are not in a good position here. I'm not saying they're not going to win, but I am saying that they're not a popular administration. Their candidate is fine on paper and I don't think is going to lose the race on her own, but is also not really run the strongest campaign. So she's not going to maybe win the race on her own. I think if she wins, it'll be more a product of anti-Trump, kind of energy from Democrats than it really will be, pro Mikey Sherrill turnout. And then the last thing I want to say is that I'm interested to see how this goes because in 2021, what we saw was that, Jack Chitterelli, the Republican, did really well in the suburbs, like especially in north central Jersey, like in Morris County. He did okay in the cities, but mostly benefited because turnout just dropped. He did really well in South Jersey, especially with the working class voters. I'm interested to see how all those groups break up. New Jersey is a really diverse state, both like politically, I'd say socioeconomically and like racially. So we have a lot to look out for on Tuesday evening. I'll release my final prediction again Monday or Tuesday morning. But what I will say is that this is a poll that is very interesting, and I think it's going to get a lot of people to change their outlook on this race. So thanks so much for watching. Let me know what you think, and I will see you all tomorrow.